the evacuees, the refugees who came from the frontland regions, that is the west of Russia, that were to become the kind of fighting grounds on the Eastern Front, people were forced back into central Russia. They were often sent down the Volga on barges and then had to settle in different Volga cities. There were 53,000 evacuees in Nizhny Novgorod province alone. Just to give you one example, 53,000, a very large number of people. If you look at the figures, certainly in this particular province, you see that these evacuees are mostly elderly, women and children. These people, they come from different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds, quite a large Jewish community moving in, and they're being forced into new environments, which is, produces massive social and cultural challenge and possibly even transformation, but certainly challenges for the local population and, of course, for these unfortunate evacuees. As well as these people who are forced to move out of the war zones as a result of conflict and loss of their homes, we also have factories which are deliberately evacuated from regions which are close to the front lines, important industries. They are removed and replaced down in safer central Russian locations. And these factories, again, so they bring a big established community. So, for example, the workers from Riga in modern-day Latvia have moved right back into the Volga provinces, and there they have to re-establish themselves. They're going to communicate with the local workers, they're going to interact with the local community. So population dislocation has a number of important implications for local communities and contributes to a sense of crisis which develops over the course of the First World War, which I think is peaking at around early 1917 in various different Russian provinces. We have heightened accusations of hooliganism and black marketeering in different regional towns as the pressure on resources from large numbers of people, large numbers of soldiers in these towns. We've got extra pressure on local resources. So, for example, the bathhouses can't cope with the number of soldiers who need to be bathed, and they close down. So that the local community don't have bathhouses anymore. These are just small things, but they contribute to people's daily lives, and it contribute to a sense of crisis that develops in this period. We also have this exposure to outside cultures, beliefs and grievances, which is part and parcel of this movement of population, and which I think is, it's hard to be tangible about, but which definitely has an impact on ordinary people's responses to and experiences of the First World War period. So just some different aspects then of population dislocation. I'm going to go on to another cost of the war, if you like. We often talk about economic costs of the war, and certainly one big economic cost of the war is that the state was obliged to pay allowances to the wives of soldiers and the immediate relatives of soldiers. The cost of these payments was enormous. 25 million soldiers' wives or soldiers' mothers or whatever received a state allowance in 1916, and the cost of these allowances between 1914 and 1917 was 2 billion rubles, which was actually 7% of Russia's total military expenditure. And it's one of those sorts of military expenditure which is often forgotten, but it's important. The state is paying those wives for the loss of their husbands or the loss of their sons. And the conscription of males under the age of 55, though, is not something that the state can really adequately compensate. For those women and for those families, they've lost their main source of labour. So we find that agriculture, which is Russia's mainstay, goes into something of a decline in the years of the war because people aren't available to work the land. The sown area in Nizhegorod province, just as an example, goes down by 50% between 1914 and 1917. That means 50% less grain being produced in that area. And 20% of households were actually completely without any sown land. That's because they were unable to work the land with their own hands without the help of their sons and their fathers. And final sort of point on in terms of these kind of household economics is the unenviable plight of the numerous invalids that emerged between 1914 and 1917. These men had a sorrowful position. You know, these guys who'd been badly injured or possibly even traumatised by their experiences in the First World War, and they're sent home because they're useless. What are they going to be in their communities? What are they going to be in their society? And this is not a period when being disabled was in any way accepted within society. So there's just another aspect of the war to consider. I'm now going to go on and just talk about the different responses of society to the war. Very often in the historiography you will hear phrases like, in Russia everyone rallied behind the Tsar when the war was announced. Okay, it's very easy to say that. It's also very easy to find some very straightforward evidence for a statement like that. For example, in Petersburg, you know, you're going to have big rallies in support of the Tsar with lots of educated society, well-dressed people standing up and cheering for the Tsar and cheering for the war and hurrah for Russia. But that's great. I mean, there's no question that educated society offered enthusiastic support for the regime and for the war. And they were very keen to participate in the state's prosecution of the war. That's a good thing for the autocracy. That offered support by Russia's educated classes. The war industry committees and the Union of Zemstvos, which is a sort of local government organisations, also provided strong practical support to the autocracy in attempting to run the war more effectively. And this should have been a bargain for these groups of society, because they wanted to help with the running of the war. They wanted to improve Russia's position, but I think in return they wanted to be taken on as partners in the Russian war effort. But what actually happened is that the autocracy was forced to accept some support from these individuals and from these groups because they needed help with the war effort, which was going so badly. But they were very reluctant, or even refused outright, to offer any kind of concessions or consistent support to these groups. So the war industry committees and the Zemstvo Union, they were utilised sometimes, but they were not allowed to really develop any kind of sense of community with government. They weren't allowed to develop their role. They weren't being offered any kind of political role, is what I'm really getting down to. The State Duma, which was Russia's representative body, was initially incredibly supportive of the autocrat, and they offered actually just to dissolve themselves immediately in order to let the autocrat get on with the war. This attitude did change, however, over the course of the war. I mean, I started by telling you what a disaster the war was, how many humiliating losses and how much terrible loss of life there was for Russia. So it's hardly surprising that the State Duma, this representative body, which was actually mainly very conservative, they actually came to be rather critical of the regime and rather critical of the way in which the war was being run. And they established something called the Progressive Bloc, which basically asked the regime to offer them a representative ministry. That is, that the Tsar's ministers should be accountable to the Duma, and that they should have faith in the war effort. By 1916 there was widespread loss of faith in government. The withdrawal of unconditional support for the Tsar from the Duma is important because it represents that the Tsar's bases of support were declining by 1916. And there's a very famous speech by a leading liberal politician called Paul Milikov, and Milikov made this very passionate speech in November of 1916, and he concluded each of his points with his rhetorical flourish which said, "What is this, stupidity or treason?" Milikov's response was that this was stupidity. Actually, it was a rhetorical question, but this speech, which was illegally distributed in large numbers across Petrograd, came to be answered by the people who read it as treason. And so increasingly we have accusations of treason being made against the autocracy. So I'd like to finish with what I think is probably the most difficult area of understanding popular responses to the war, and that's looking at ordinary people's responses to the war. Now, in some historiography it's traditionally been depicted that the Russian people as one loyally stood behind the Tsar, everyone was for the war effort, hurrah, 3 cheers, all that kind of stuff. Well, that's all well and good, and you certainly find that in some of the contemporary reports on ordinary people's representations of their interpretation of the war. However, it is very difficult to make these kinds of generalisations with any sort of confidence. More recently, some historians who looked at responses to the draft, that is, being mobilised, being drawn into the army, find some quite different sorts of reactions to the war. What he finds quite a lot of is fatalism, not enthusiasm, but fatalism. So that means that soldiers, they knew that this was their duty, they knew that they couldn't avoid it, but they tried very hard to avoid it, I should say. So some of the recent work has shown how soldiers tried very hard to avoid the draft. They were willing to self-mutilate, they were willing to take quite unpleasant substances in order to give the impression of having a serious illness, all these sorts of things. These are examples, are difficult to get to, but they're examples of ordinary people's resistance to the war, reluctance to serve. They knew they had to, they didn't have any choice, but they tried to get out of it. And it's an interesting area. It's difficult to make any confident assertions about how ordinary people felt about the war, and I would encourage you as scholars to think carefully about those kind of generalisations. Another recent theme of work related to the First World War and ordinary people is the idea that the war might have helped develop a sense of citizenship among Russia's ordinary people. What I mean by this is that by participating in a national war effort, that ordinary people, particularly in rural areas, were able to better position themselves as members of the Russian state, that they were part of a bigger thing, that they weren't just a peasant from a particular region, that they were a peasant who was part of Russia. And so this is an important aspect of the war period, that maybe people were starting to relate themselves more to a national body, have more awareness of Russia's geographical scope as a result of their interest in the war. I'd like to make a couple of conclusions just to finish this presentation. First, to make the obvious point, which is that war has a profound impact on all the warring nations and on all their citizens. There's just no getting away from that at all. But we can say that this impact may be accentuated in Russia by certain particular factors, in particular the size of the country. This is very important because it shows the weakness of infrastructure, particular difficulties in governing Russia. Lack of developed citizenship is something which people have talked about, that maybe as this massive empire, Russia's ordinary citizens were not so aware of themselves, they were not so willing to make massive sacrifices for the state, for this abstract notion. And for a lack of clear tradition of a harmonious accord between elite society and the state. And this is certainly something which developed as a real problem for Russia, that people like that liberal politician Paul Milikov that I talked about, he wasn't willing to keep giving the autocrat absolute unconditional support. He recognised that the war effort was not going well. He recognised that the efforts of elite society to improve the war effort were not being recognised and were not being acted on. Therefore, his only alternative was actually to start to challenge the autocrat. It's hard to know how ordinary people related both to the war and to the regime. We have rather partial evidence for this, and this is something that we're always going to be cautious about making any big statements on. But finally, I think that we can see that revolution, it's not just about the First World War, of course, but the revolution of 1917 becomes explicable, it becomes understandable in the context that I've tried to lay out today.